Can we ever be justified in going to war, or should we always avoid it? Can there ever be a good reason to go to war, and if we do go into war, is there a proper way to conduct ourselves? Thomas Aquinas discusses the just war theory in order to answer some of these questions. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about Thomas Aquinas and his just war theory. First, we'll talk about his theory, and then we'll talk about some other further developments in just war theory that come after, and then we'll talk about how some of these principles apply to self-defense, and we'll talk about the principle of double effect. Aquinas on just war theory. This is taken from the Summa Theologica. First, he asks whether it is always sinful to wage war. He says no, and in order for a war to be just, three things are necessary. So there's three principles, and each of these need to be met in order for it to be permissible, morally good, to go to war. If any of these three are not met, then you should not go to war. And only under these circumstances is war permissible. Augustine was actually the first to discuss just war theory, but at least as a sort of system. But Aquinas was the earliest to really systematically be a systematic expositor of the theory. So Thomas Aquinas is usually considered the first in the tradition of just war theory in articulating it as a sophisticated and specific theory. So the first principle, the first criterion that needs to be met is that it needs to be proper authority. Okay, proper authority needs to be the one who wages war. The organizing body must have a just authority. That's to say that the government should wage war, not individuals. Right? Recognized national authorities, and there's reason for this. Aquinas says it is not the business of a private individual to declare war, because he can seek for redress of his rights from the tribunal of his superior. In other words, it is not the job, the role of individual citizens to seek justice. Right? We have a system in place where we have mediators, because if justice were in the hands of individuals, then it would not be justice, it would be revenge, and it would escalate into a lot of feuds, and there would be no middleman to judge fairly between two different people. We need a middleman. We need somebody who stands separate from individuals, who can be a moderator, function as a moderator, and that's the role of the government. So it's the government's role to enact justice, not an individual's role. And so the government, the nation, the collective nation wages war, not individuals. Government arbitrates justice, not individuals, or else it would be impartial, or else it wouldn't be impartial and would be revenge instead of justice. All right, he says, moreover, it is not the business of a private individual to summon together the people, which has to be done in wartime. It's the role of government to organize people for war. Otherwise, there would be anarchy and constant fighting within a nation. He also says the care of the commonweal, which is to say the commonwealth, is committed to those who are in authority. Right, so it's the authority's job to look after the commonwealth of the people. Right? It is the role of government, which is created by the people, to protect the people and encourage human flourishing. Right? It's the role of government, which the people have set up. It's the role of the government to encourage the care of the commonwealth in a way that an individual is not able to care for the whole commonwealth. It's their business, as I continue reading here, it is their business to watch over the commonweal of the city, kingdom, or province subject to them. And just as it is lawful for them to have recourse to the sword in defending the commonweal against internal disturbances, which is to say that the police have the right to use violence in order to protect people, and also the judicial system has the right to enact punishment. So since they have the right to use violence to preserve peace within the nation, when they punish evildoers, so too it is their business to have recourse to the sword of war in defending the commonweal against external enemies. So when someone inside of the nation or outside of the nation is acting violently, it is proper to use violence to stop them from killing many people. It is proper to use violence only when it is for the purpose of justice by a proper authority. But we also have two more criteria coming up. So the purpose of government is to protect its people from both internal and external threats. If that's the case, can you ever have a revolution or a civil war? Right? So a revolution is a group of individuals within a country who declare war, all right, for this and start a civil war. Of course, if it's successful, it's called a revolution. If it's not successful, it's just a civil war. So can you ever have one of these? Yes. If the governing authority is not fulfilling its role of protecting the people and encouraging human flourishing, then it is not a proper authority, and it is the duty of the people to establish a new order that will protect the people. So if authority is in a vast way neglecting its duty, of course, this is not to say we can overturn the government every time it does anything wrong. No, what this is saying is that if the government no longer fulfills the role of government, which is protecting the people and encouraging human flourishing, if it no longer does that at all and has become tyrannical, then it is the duty of the people to establish a new order that will protect the people. Let's look at the second one, which is just cause. This is to say that the enemy has done evil and must receive retributive justice. Okay, you can have proper authority, but you can't just go to war with anybody. You have to go to war with bad guys. You go to war not with your allies, not with good guys. You go to war with bad guys, people who have done evil and must receive retributive justice. This is tyrants abroad or even at home. Tyrants who are killing lives and functioning in a tyrannical way, threatening people's lives. Okay, Aquinas says, namely, that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it on account of some fault. Okay, we want to enact justice. We want to be agents of justice, not agents of revenge, but agents of justice. That those who do evil are punished, and that evil is stopped. We want to stop evil in order to preserve peace. The third one is just intention, which is to say that those who are going to war must have their motive must be to obtain something good. Right? He says it is necessary that the belligerents should have a rightful intention, so that they intend the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil, with the object of securing peace, of punishing evildoers, and of uplifting the good. Okay, good motives need to be in place. So you can have a proper authority declaring war, and you can have war being declared against evildoers, but you can still have a bad intention. Just because of those things does not mean that we have a good intention. For it may happen that the war is declared, this is continuing Aquinas' quote here. This is Aquinas talking. For it may happen that the war is declared by the legitimate authority and for a just cause, and yet be rendered unlawful through a wicked intention. Hence, Augustine says, the passion for inflicting harm, here are some bad intentions. The passion for inflicting harm, the cruel thirst for vengeance, an unpacific, which is to say peaceful and relentless spirit, the fever of revolt, the lust of power, or perhaps the lust of land or the lust of resources, and such like things. All these are rightly condemned in war. Right? War is not for the sake of conquesting, just for the sake of conquesting to gain more land or for the sake of violence or anything like that. It has to be for the sake of obtaining good or stopping evil. Here's a caveat. Are we justified in starting to engage in war? All right, let's think about that question. This is not a quote. This is just a question that we can ask ourselves. Are we justified in starting to engage in war? We want to ask this question of these three criteria. When we are considering starting a war or entering into a war, we want to ask whether or not we have proper authority, just cause, and just intention. However, that is a different question than asking, are we justified in continuing the war? All right, a war may start with justice, but circumstances may change, demanding the war to end. Or a war may start in violation of these principles, but once it has already started, immediately ceasing may cause more harm than good. Right? So it's asking, are we justified in starting the war is different than asking, are we justified in continuing the war? Two different questions. Aquinas asks whether it is lawful to lay ambushes in war. Okay, this is starting to talk about just conduct in war, right? Can we do guerrilla warfare, or should we all stand in line and look at each other, make sure that we see the whites of the other person's eyes, we face them face to face before we ever attack? Or can we sneak up on them? He says, yes, we can ambush. The object of laying ambushes is in order to deceive the enemy. Now, a man may be deceived by another's word or deed in two ways. Okay, the first way asks, can we lie? First, through being told something false. Right? This is the first way that we can deceive, is through being told something false, or through the breaking of a promise. And this is always unlawful. This is a quote. I should have had quotation marks on this one. This is a quote from Aquinas. No one ought to deceive the enemy in this way, for there are certain rights of war and covenants which ought to be observed even among enemies, as Ambrose states. So he quotes Ambrose here, who is a previous philosopher, actually a mentor of Augustine. But he is saying that you should never lie, because lying is bad, and you do not do something evil for the sake of something good. So lying is not permissible for Aquinas in deceiving the enemy. However, there will be a way that you can deceive the enemy. We'll get to that in a second. You should never do something bad, lying to do something good, preserve peace. Also take note of that he mentions sort of convention, which is nowadays called rights of war and conventions. Right? He says that's what he says in his quote above, and this just refers to just conduct within war. These will be described more later. A lot of times, even laws are made between nations, international laws that restrict what kinds of weapons or what things that you can do in war. So there are laws about how we should treat POWs. There are laws about what weapons we may not use. Things like this. These are modern rights of war and conventions. So secondly, can we deceive through silence? He says, secondly, a man may be deceived by what we say or do, because we do not declare our purposes or meaning to him. Now, we are not always bound to do this, since even we're not always, he's saying here, we do not always have to say everything. We can sometimes just have silence. Since even in the sacred doctrine, many things have been concealed, especially from unbelievers, lest they deride it. He's just appealing to his Christian doctrine and handling Christian doctrine. He says you don't always need to say what the Christian doctrine is in context where people will misunderstand. You can remain silent until a point where they can understand, and then speak. Wherefore, much more ought the plan of campaign be hidden from the enemy, right? So we can hide our plan from the enemy. For this reason, among other things, that a soldier has to learn is the art of concealing his purpose, lest it come to the enemy's knowledge, as stated in the book on strategy by Frontinus. Such like concealment is what is meant by an ambush, which may be lawfully employed in just war. Right? So all of this is really just to say that you can deceive your enemy and ambush them, but not by doing something evil, like lying, for the sake of something good, like preserving peace. Silence is just doing nothing strategically. Some developments in just war theory have come in response to Aquinas' theories, right? These are not criticisms, these are developments. Sort of, let's take these three and make them even more specific, develop them further. Right, one category of developments is called jus ad bellum, which is the right to war. These are justifications for war. In the same spirit as the three principles we've already given, here are criteria that need to be met in order to start a war. These criteria are not a replacement of the three that we've already gone over. They are a development of and addition to the ones that we have already gone over. All right, it has to be a last resort. All other means of putting an end to the conflict must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. Right? We've already tried diplomacy. We've already tried everything we possibly can to avoid war and put an end to the evil, and it has not worked. So the only means left to us by necessity is war. It's a last resort. Probability of success. There must be serious prospects of success. So if we think that, let's say, we are a very weak nation and we have a very big enemy, we have no probability of success. So we should not engage in war, because it will just be needless violence and death. Proportionality. Are the benefits going to outweigh the risk? Right? Proportionality. Are the benefits of going to war going to outweigh the cost and the risk? An aspect of proportionality is that there should be lasting impact. It must be worth it to go to war. That is to say, we don't want to engage in this bloody, violent war where people are going to die, and the effect is only to establish peace for a very short amount of time, let's say a year, and then conflict arises again, the same conflict, right? Is there going to be lasting impact? Otherwise, it's not worth it. It's not worth the risk. And then we have another category in just war theory called jus in bello, which is to say the right in war. This is just conduct. So this is talking about within war, how do we conduct ourselves in a moral way, in a just way. These are also developments to add on to the original 3 criteria. First is distinction. The acts of war should be directed towards enemy combatants and not towards non-combatants caught in circumstances they are not supporting, right? So we attack enemy soldiers and not civilians who live in the enemy countries. This also includes the fair treatment of prisoners, because once a soldier is a prisoner, they are no longer a combatant. They are ineffective. Of course, we do not want to let them immediately go, because then they will become a combatant again, but we want to treat them well, treat them as non-combatants under our care and treat them well, rather than torturing them or just inflicting harm just for the fun of it. Another is military necessity. Every act of war, every missile fired, every bullet fired must be aimed at and necessary for obtaining the goal of the war, i.e., attacks should be aimed at strategic targets to maximize the likelihood of ending the war and minimize collateral damage, right? We want to be as effective as possible in this war in order to end it quickly and minimize the number of deaths on our side as well as on the enemy's side. Proportionality. No act of war should be overkill, so to speak. We're not going to send in a nuclear warhead to destroy one individual, right? That's overkill. No means evil in itself. In Latin, that's malum in se, malum in essence. For example, we should not use mass rape as a tool in war, or forcing enemy combatants to fight against their own side, or using weapons whose effects cannot be controlled. That's kind of part of the overkill thing with proportionality, right? So in a similar way, like we talk about in some of the ethics videos, especially the Aquinas video on ethics, where he talks about circumstance, how is an important aspect. We want to not just have a good motive and do the right thing, but we need to do it in the right way. All right? The ends do not justify the means. Let's talk about how some of these principles apply in self-defense. Right? Aquinas asks whether it is lawful to kill a man in self-defense. He introduces the principle of double effect, which has been a major principle throughout ethical philosophy, moral philosophy, ever since Thomas Aquinas. He says, nothing hinders one act from having 2 effects, only one of which is intended while the other is beside the intention. So in other words, you do something and you have an intended goal, and the other effect is accidental. All right, let's explain this further. Aquinas says, now moral acts take their species, or their essence. What is this specific act? According to what is intended. So the act is defined by its intention, and not according to what is beside the intention, since it is accidental. So whatever my intention was, that is my choice, and that is my action, right? So if I intend to go to work and I drive to work, that's my intention, and that describes my action. And other factors like the route that I take or which car I use, that doesn't matter, because my action is still going to work. That's the essence, because that's what is intended. Now, applied to self-defense, he says, accordingly, the act of self-defense may have two effects. One is the saving of one's life. That's what's intended. The other is the slaying of the aggressor. Therefore, this act, since one's intention is to save one's own life, is not unlawful, seeing that it is natural to everything to keep itself in being as far as possible. So this involves the proportionality principle. Right? He says, and yet, though proceeding from a good intention, an act may be rendered unlawful if it be out of proportion to the end. Wherefore, if a man in self-defense uses more than necessary violence, it will be unlawful. Whereas if he repel force with moderation, his defense will be lawful, because according to the jurists, it is lawful to repel force by force, provided one does not exceed the limits of a blameless defense. So in other words, if you feel physically threatened, but not in such a way where your life is threatened, you know that your life is not being threatened, just that there's some violence that is going to happen. Let's say you get in a fight at school, a little fist fight in school. Your self-defense should not be to immediately try to kill this other person, right? Your self-defense should be in moderation, not overly violent. Let's talk about the intent to kill. Aquinas says, but as it is unlawful to take a man's life except for the public authority acting for the common good, as stated above, it is not lawful for a man to intend killing a man in self-defense, except for such as have public authority, who, while intending to kill a man in self-defense, refer this to the public good, as to the case of a soldier fighting against the foe, and in the minister of the judge, the police, struggling with robbers, although even these sin if they be moved by private animosity. So this is to say that the intent to kill is only permissible by governing authority, when achieving the common good in just war conditions. So the policeman and the soldier, when they are in a firefight shooting at bad guys and being shot at, of course they are going to be motivated by self-defense, but even more than that, they are motivated by preserving the peace, by establishing peace. And so they can intend to kill because they are agents of justice. But individuals are not agents of justice and cannot intend to kill. So when an individual is engaging in self-defense, they do not intend to kill, they intend to defend themselves and preserve their own lives, and are actually intending to not kill because they are intending to use as little and proportional violence as possible, if at all possible. And so if they do kill the assailant, then it is not their primary intention. Some other notes on this self-defense. This is not to say that Aquinas subscribes to lesser of two evils thinking, which is to say conflicting absolutism. In my video on relativism versus objectivism, I describe three different kinds of absolutism, which are conflicting absolutism, non-conflicting absolutism, and graded absolutism. In conflicting absolutism, it says that in certain moral dilemmas, like self-defense, no choice is morally right. Both choices, to let the other person kill you or to defend yourself and kill them, both choices include some evil. However, we want to do the lesser of the two evils. Instead, Aquinas subscribes to either non-conflicting moral absolutism or graded absolutism. Both of those will say that self-defense is not the lesser of two evils, but rather it is actually good. It is accomplishing something good. The motive is to avoid ends justifying the means. The motive in choosing non-conflicting moral absolutism or in choosing graded absolutism is that Aquinas would be trying to avoid subscribing to the utilitarian proposition that ends justify the means. In fact, even if you have a good motive, a good end, that does not mean that how you do it is indifferent. That means you can intend to do something good, but in fact you try to accomplish it by means of doing something bad. That's bad. If you're going to accomplish good, you need to do it in a good way, not in a bad way. Here's some diagnostic questions to test whether double effect permits an action. Let's investigate intention. Do I intend a good end? This is applied from just war theory. Am I using evil means to accomplish a good end? Proportionality. Am I overly violent or excessive? Proper authority. Am I the right person to do this? Should I call the police instead? Am I motivated by private animosity or a personal agenda, like vengeance, or just overly angry, wrath? No vigilante justice is permitted. Sorry, Avengers and Justice League and other superheroes. No vigilante justice is permitted because they are not proper authorities established by the consensus of the civilian population. Right? The civilians cannot defend themselves and protect their rights as individuals as effective as a governing authority. And so citizens establish a governing authority and the authority of the government derives from the people, and so the government protects people and encourages human flourishing in a way where individuals are less effective, which is just to say we work better together than apart. And so that authority, established by the people, has the right to enact justice, not individuals, because individuals cannot be checked and cannot be kept in check by the government. They are rogue, so to speak. No vigilante justice is permitted in Aquinas, however entertaining it might be. Let's look at a sort of moral dilemma, a hypothetical, strange situation that may never exist, just to tease out some of the questions that we want to ask in investigating double effect. This is the famous trolley problem proposed by Philippa Foot in 1967. Case number 1. There is a runaway trolley barreling down the railway tracks. Ahead on the tracks, there are 5 people tied up and unable to move. The trolley is headed straight for them. You are standing some distance off in the train yard, next to a lever. If you pull this lever, the trolley will switch to a different set of tracks. However, you notice that there is one person on the side track. Here, your options are: 1. It is obligatory to preserve the most number of people. Your rationale might be either ends justify the means, which is utilitarianism, which is probably the most common response that anyone watching this video will have. However, that is largely just because of the current culture of our society, and there are many things to think about to investigate whether the ends really do justify the means in situations like this, or double effect. So this is what Aquinas would say. Aquinas would say that you are not intending to kill one person as a means to protecting the 5 other people. Rather, you are intending to switch the track as a means to protecting the other people. So, killing is not the tool by which you are saving lives. So you are not doing ends justify the means. That is what Aquinas would say. Another option is to say that moral wrongs are already in place in this situation, and moving the trolley to another track constitutes a participation in the moral wrong. making one partially responsible for the death when otherwise no one would be responsible. All right, this is to say, if you act at all, then you enter into the situation and you become part of the evil that is already going on. Some rationale might be non-conflicting moral absolutism. Perhaps that might be one possibility. You might say it's always wrong to do a certain thing, even if it's going to lead to good consequences, right? Some sort of absolutism about rules. There might be other rationales and other rationales for either of the two options as well. Let's take a second case. Let's change it a little bit. As before, a trolley is hurtling down a track towards 5 people. You're on a bridge under which it will pass, and you can stop it by putting something very heavy in front of it. As it happens, there's a very fat man next to you. Your only way to stop the trolley is to push him over the bridge and onto the track, killing him to save 5. Should you proceed? This is an adaptation of the trolley problem proposed by Judith Jarvis Thomson. Right? So your options. You could say it's obligatory to preserve the most number of people. The rationale here is now only utilitarianism, saying that the ends justify the means. Aquinas would not advocate this option because you are intending an evil, namely killing the fat man, as the tool, as the means by which you are going to save life. So you should never do something wrong for the sake of something good. So this is no longer double effect in Aquinas' eyes. Rather, it would be only utilitarianism, saying the ends justify the means. Or the other option is you could do nothing, which in this situation is what Aquinas would say. And although it is unfortunate that 5 people die instead of 1 person, it is not your fault that 5 people die instead of 1 person. And it would have been morally blameworthy if you were to have pushed that person, that fat person, onto the railroad track, right? Just to make it more sentimental, if that's more effective for you, what if that person was a child, right? What if the person was a child? Would you still throw them onto the track to save 5 others? Well, it depends on if you're really dedicated to utilitarianism or if you have some sense of absolutism as well, that you cannot do something evil for the sake of something good, right? What's the case? Rationale, moral wrongs are already in place in the situation. Or you can never do evil for the sake of good. This is what Aquinas would say, which would be graded absolutism or non-conflicting absolutism. And there might be other rationales as well. But let's adapt this case just a little bit. Would it change anything? What if the fat man was in fact the villain who tied up the 5 people, right? Would this change anything for you? Aquinas would say, well, and you would want to ask, is justice in your hands? Aquinas would say this would not change anything because it is not the role of an individual to enact justice. Even if they were a policeman, this would not be proper. This would not be the kind of justice that the proper governing authority will enact. So the question is if you disagree with any of Aquinas' answers, does that mean that you have to reject one of the principles of just war theory? And if so, if you are rejecting one of the criteria of just war theory, then it would seem that it might advocate more evils in war, because all of the principles of just war theory are for the purposes of restricting evil. And so if we reject one of those, then there are less restrictions on evil. But maybe it's proper to do so. Who knows? What is your view? The important thing in these cases is to realize that sometimes in a very narrow circumstance, it may feel right to do a certain thing, like push the fat man onto the tracks and save 5 lives, something like that. Just because it feels right, and your gut response may be to say that that's the right thing to do. Think also about whether that is actually wise and the right thing to do. Because if we do that, what does that mean about our moral principles? What moral principles have we just subscribed to? Have we just subscribed to the idea that ends justify the means? And if so, now that we have that principle that the ends justify the means, what other kinds of situations may that lead to that cause other evils? Who knows? That's the case. That's what the situation we want to ask ourselves is, if we're going to be consistent in our ethic, then what moral principles should we live by? Here's another case. See if this changes anything. Trolley case number 4. Let's modify the first problem. There's now a loop in the track. The trolley is headed towards 5 people. You can switch the direction of the trolley to run over one fat person instead. This person is fat enough to stop the trolley and prevent the 5 from dying. However, the fat man will die. If the trolley runs over the 5 first, all 6 will die. The only important difference between this case and the first is that the one person is no longer unintentionally killed in double effect. He becomes part of the means or plan to save others. You can already guess which one Aquinas would say. In this slight change of case number 1, Aquinas would say that you should not change the tracks because your intention would change to be to kill the fat person, and that is never a good intention, no matter what the purpose is. One more thing. What about trolley case number 5? We just add a bit of track. Now the fat man can go free if you do nothing. The choice is using killing as part of your plan, right? So you can switch the track and it will kill one fat man and save 5 people, right? But you are intending killing for the sake of a good. Your other choice is to do nothing, in which case 5 people will die, so more people will die. But the fat man still gets to go free, right? A slight change. Does this change anything? We can postulate many different cases, but what's the point of these? To investigate proper moral reasoning. Is it permissible to do evil for the sake of good? How do we compare the relative value of different moral principles? Do the ends justify the means? What will our answers imply for everyday reasoning and other situations? Is it permissible in war to kill one innocent person to save others? In war, there are always foreseeable, unintended civilian casualties. Are we guilty for those, or does double effect excuse us? I encourage you to watch my video on relativism versus objectivism, as well as some of my other basic ethical videos to gain some more categories on how to think of these kinds of situations. Of course, a very important one in the thought of Aquinas is my Aquinas lecture on virtue, where he talks about the 7 circumstantial variables that play into whether or not an action is right or wrong. That's another way of investigating a moral situation. All of these tools are tools in our tool belt to learn wisdom and to grow in morality. This has been Aquinas on just war theory, and now let's do the write-up. Which trolley problem do you find the most difficult to answer? Cases 1 through 5. Why is it the most difficult? What is your answer and reasoning? Do you agree with the just war theory? Yes or no? And why? Under what circumstances, if any, is it permissible to use a nuclear bomb? Use the principles of just war theory to justify your answer.